All right, welcome to today's webinar on cover crop seeding, establishment, and termination. I am Rob Myers, an agronomist with the University of Missouri and director of the Center for Regenerative Agriculture. We're pleased to be able to offer this four-part webinar series this month, not only today, but each of the next 3 Thursdays. I'll show you a slide a little later of the upcoming topics we have if you haven't seen those. And we wanted to do this. Some of you may have attended a cover crop workshop that we offered at Bradford Farm last fall. Others may have attended the cover crop and pollinator program that was held a couple weeks ago out at the Bay Farm run by the Missouri Soybean Association. To get into more details about specific cover crop management practices. So today, obviously, we'll be getting at some of the things we do in the fall and early spring. Next week, we'll have a chance to hear more about wildlife impacts and management related to cover crops. Later, we'll get into working with your cash crops like corn and soybeans after cover crops and grazing of cover crops. So first of all, I want to thank Kelly Wilson, the Assistant Director of the Center for Regenerative Ag, for organizing these webinars and working with MDC staff, and we're pleased to have you here today. So please be thinking of your questions as we go through this. You can be typing them in the chat, or there'll be opportunity to ask them over Zoom as we get to the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to dive right in here with the outline that we're going to go through. So we're going to start by talking about some different seeding methods. I know some of these will be familiar to you, but there's actually some newer techniques that have popped up, different equipment approaches and so on. So you'll get to see some photos of some of that equipment. We'll talk a bit about timing of seeding because that's obviously important, particularly for some of the species we work with. Increasingly, there are farmers that are trying interseeding, planting cover crops in July or June, or even at the time of planting their cash crop. And then we'll end up by going over some termination approaches, both different management strategies and, again, timing with termination. So starting out with the planting, we'll be doing that relatively soon here for some farms. Traditionally, when we look at cover crop seeding in Missouri, we're either using a drill or broadcast seeding, and we'll talk about some other methods being used. Broadcasting can be done by any number of means. We can do it with an airplane, we can do it with a fertilizer spreader, other techniques. But when we are broadcasting, and I would guess in Missouri, maybe roughly a third, we don't know the exact percentage, is broadcast. The larger the seed, the harder it will be to get good seed soil contact. And as you're probably well aware, for anything we plant in terms of a seed, getting that good seed to soil contact is really important for that seed to be able to take up moisture for the soil and maintain moisture during the germination phase. So if we have a harder or larger seed like an Austrian winter pea, broadcasting that usually doesn't work too well, whereas a small seed like a radish seed can work quite well with broadcasting. We are seeing more use of precision planters like corn planters, and I'll talk more about some of the reasons for that here in a minute. One general thing I would say is that can work pretty well for a single species or sometimes 2 species, but if we're doing a blend of multiple cover crop species, then we're much better off using a grain drill than a precision planter just by the nature of the way they work. And then planting method, of course, will be tied to the dates and when we're trying to get that cover crop seeded and what our options are at that time. So again, we'll get into this more detail as we go through it. So again, starting thing is if you want to help a farmer be highly successful with planting a cover crop, start with a grain drill. They may end up over time using some other approaches, but if they're just going to do a single field, I would highly encourage them to, if they don't have their own drill, borrow a neighbor's, or maybe from the conservation district one might be available, but that'll give them a much higher probability of getting good establishment with that cover crop. Now, we see farmers as they gain experience with cover crops using other approaches. One of them is to use the row crop planter. This is a 60-foot row crop planter, and the farmer that was using this one in Indiana said they actually use a variety of approaches, but he said this row crop planter was their favorite because they could get over more acres and they could use a little bit lower seeding rate because of the precision nature of the equipment. Now, if we're using a row crop planter, it's better if we have one that has split rows so we can get that cover crop seeded like on 15-inch centers instead of 30-inch centers. I have run into farmers that say they don't like to use the row crop planter because they feel it puts a little too much wear on the planting units by doing all that cover crop seeding, but it's highly individual depending on the farmer. But certainly it's become a popular option for some. A relatively new approach we've seen over the last 5 years or so is the use of vertical tillage tools with cover crop seeders. About 3 years ago, I was at the Farm Progress Show in Illinois, which attracts a couple 100,000 farmers a year. And of the 9 or 10 vertical tillage brands I saw at the show being demonstrated, literally every single one had a cover crop seeder either on it or shown next to it. So this has become a popular option. If you think about it, if a farmer's already out there doing a vertical tillage pass after their fall harvest, why not be able to spread some cover crop seed at the same time? And the vertical tillage tool, of course, provides a little bit of incorporation of that seed, which can be good. Now, the only caution would be if we're doing something like rye, it can work quite well because rye tolerates being planted, an inch, inch and a half deep. If we're doing something like radishes, we have to be a little more careful because those need to be planted fairly shallow, like a ½ inch or less. And we can end up with some of the seed too deep, depending on whether it's thrown at the front of the vertical tillage tool or in back. In fact, we might need to adjust that depending on the type of seed. But these use an air blower to distribute the seed through lines that drop the seed typically down in front of the vertical till unit. We do see other tillage tools with similar air units for seeding on them. Here's a rolling harrow on the left, and on the right, Horsch has a tillage device that they put an air seeder on. So lots of different options out in the marketplace today. Bottom line, we can say every day counts with fall cover crop seeding. This is a video by a farmer named Steve Groff in Pennsylvania. He tries, if he's post-harvest seeding, he's got some high moisture corn he was taking for silage here. And he's in there seeding that right away after that silage is coming off. In fact, on his farm, he showed here on the left is a strip that he planted on October 7th, and just a week earlier on September 29th, looking a month later, actually about 5-6 weeks later, the big difference there in the cover crop establishment. So that's just a good example of why every day is important. It might seem like, if it's late September, oh gee, we've got a little more time, but really every day is quite important. So one way we see some farmers getting that seed out there a little faster is to put a seeder right onto their combine. This isn't real common, but it's been used in quite a number of locations. So this is a Gandy box that, again, has an air blower, and it's going to distribute that seed through these tubes that go down underneath the header of the combine. You can see that tube there, and there's a little diverter. And it works pretty well because that seed's being broadcast before the residue that comes out the back of the combine is thrown out. So it gets a little coverage, which helps keep that seed a little moisture. What I have heard from some farmers that have tried this approach is if they're doing something like rye, they don't like stopping too often to put the rye seed in because we're putting on a fair amount of some of those winter cereals. But if you're using something like radishes, which is at about 3 pounds an acre versus 15 times that much for rye, we don't need to stop nearly so often. We can get over a lot of acres with a full seed box of something like radishes or canola. So it kind of depends on what's being used, but that is a viable technique that may work in some situations. On more farms, we're seeing use of high clearance seeding devices. Sometimes this is being done by ag retailers. Sometimes farmers have modified their own units. So this is a company called Hagee that is based in Iowa. I've been through their factory and seen some of the various trials they've done with cover crop interseeding. Here they've modified a high clearance sprayer with a 90-foot boom, and they feel that they can do about 500 acres a day of seeding, which actually we have a farmer in Northeast Missouri that purchased one of these and not only seeding a lot of their own acres, but doing it for neighbors, and feels it's been a profitable enterprise for them. So they take the normal box where their spray would be in and swap that out for a seed box. And again, there's a blower that's going to blow the seed out through these tubes, and then there's a little metal diverter that'll help broadcast it. Now you might say, what's the advantage of this over an airplane? Well, if it's a really windy day, the airplane's not going to be able to fly that seed on. You could still go with the interseeder. On the flip side, if it's a real muddy period, then the airplane can go and not the interseeder. But I do think this is an option for ag retailers that have some of this equipment otherwise sitting idle at that time of the year. Typically, they can modify it to do the seeding in a half day or so. If we are doing aerial seeding or even interseeding with that high clearance equipment, timing is critical. We have a relatively wide window with corn. As soon as it starts turning color a little bit, we have maybe a month that we can go in there and interseed. With soybeans, it's more like a week. That timing is really important. We want the leaves to be starting to turn yellow, but not yet having dropped. Because if we get a thick layer of soybean leaves over the soil surface, and then we broadcast our seed on top of that layer of leaves, they're just going to sit there and not germinate unless we get a really big rainstorm to wash them in. So getting them on timely is important. If we go too early while the soybeans are still green, then they're going to be shaded out and not established well. And it does pay to find a pilot that's experienced with cover crops for sure. Another newer approach we've seen is using a interseeder that can go in when the corn is like knee-high or less. So here's a unit that's commercially manufactured from a company called Interseeder Tech. They grew out of efforts by Penn State researchers to develop this approach. They call it a 3-in-1 option because you can seed the cover crop with this modified drill at the same time you're applying liquid nitrogen and spraying for weeds. So you get 3 operations done in a single pass. I've seen this done, both demonstrations and visited fields later where it was done. Typically, the cover crop will come up. The advantage of doing the drill versus just broadcasting it in is you get it into moisture a little more effectively. So you can see some clover here on the lower right coming up well. And typically, that cover crop's going to stay small, just a few inches tall until the corn is harvested. There's 2 challenges. One is to adjust our herbicide strategy so that whatever herbicides we're using, especially residuals, are not going to cause a problem for that interseeded cover crop. And then secondly, having enough moisture for that cover crop to persist. So I see this as a little better option for the upper Midwest where they have really short falls. I would worry in Missouri, sometimes our summer's a little dry like we're seeing this year. It could be challenging to keep that cover crop alive until the fall weather, but it is a viable option that some farmers are using. So just a few other points in terms of avoiding residual herbicide issues. I've quite often been in a field where radishes have been broadcast in late August and they came up well, but then they started looking really screwy. You know, they start growing really curved and they just end up dying because that residual herbicide is taking them out. So part of it is thinking about what cover crop are you using and when are you going to be seeding it. The earlier we're seeding, the more we have to pay attention to that residual herbicide. And it's more of an issue for some things. So things like brassicas, the radishes, turnips, and rape seeds are going to be more sensitive. Whereas we look at some of the cereal crops like cereal rye, wheat, they're more tolerant. In fact, cereal rye is usually not something that has a problem with residual herbicides, although there's always exceptions. Just another general tip before we switch over to termination is, you know, if you're talking to a farmer working with MDC ground or other situations, you know, they're looking for a starting point. It would be kind of overwhelming with all the different cover crops. To have them start simple, something like cereal rye before soybeans is very well proven and is an easy way to get started that's pretty reliable. So to summarize, getting that cover crop established at the appropriate time is real key to optimum benefit. If we're looking at something like radishes, we need to do that relatively early in September. If we're doing something like rye, we can go much later, even into early November, mid-November. But the earlier we can get any of these on, the better to a point. And certainly some of the legumes, we want to have those on by early October, if at all possible. Getting good seed to soil contact and making sure that that seed can access soil moisture is important. So that can be a challenge with broadcast seeding, really an advantage to any direct seeding method like a drill or row crop planter. If we can get that seed in before the harvest of the cash crop, that can certainly be beneficial. And a lot of bigger farmers that are doing thousands of acres of cover crops, they're using a variety of methods. They're not just using an airplane or just using a drill. They'll do as much with a drill as they have time for, and then they'll do some other fields, maybe more remote fields with an airplane, or have their ag retailer spread it with a fertilizer spreader. So a variety of approaches is fine for any given farm, but just having a strategy ahead of time is important. Okay, I want to switch over to termination and go through a few key points here, because this is almost as important as getting that cover crop seed established. Fortunately, there's a variety of ways we can terminate that cover crop. The easiest, of course, is if we pick a species that's going to winter kill. So if you have a farmer that's trying cover crops for the first time and they're a little nervous about how that cover crop might impact planting their corn or soybeans, maybe start them out with something that's going to winter kill. So it could be oats or radishes or turnips. We've got several different options there that can work. There's other brassicas. That way they don't have anything to deal with in the spring. They can just go in and plant normally like they are used to doing. Of course, the downside is we lose some of the erosion protection that we'd have for an overwintering cover crop. And from a soil health standpoint, we know there's a lot of benefits to keeping a living root out in that soil year round, if at all possible. So if we do have something overwintering, normally in Missouri or really anywhere in the Midwest, our most common option is a herbicide termination. And many of our farmers are already doing a spring herbicide, what they would call a burn down application, usually with glyphosate, to kill any overwintering weeds or early spring weeds. So it's just a matter of just making sure what chemicals they're using at that time that they're normally doing the spring burn down are appropriate to the cover crop. We do have other options, though. From a mechanical standpoint, we can use a roller crimper or mowing. I'll show you more about that. Occasionally, we'll see people terminating with grazing and occasionally with tillage. So part of terminating is kind of understanding the crop. We do have a lot of summer cover crops that'll be killed by relatively mild conditions. Doesn't have to get much below freezing to knock out things like buckwheat, sun hemp, cowpeas, and sunflowers. On the other hand, if we have some cool season crops, something like spring oats, that's going to keep growing well past the first frost. It's going to take about 18 degrees typically to kill spring oats. We can go, if we're trying to graze oats, we might plant winter oats, so they'll keep growing a little bit longer. Radishes are going to be killed at around 20. So typically these are going to be killed in mid to late December, depending on the winter conditions. So terminating with herbicides. So the first thing to know is when we're going out there in the spring to terminate, farmers have to have a little bit of patience. If it's a cold day, it's only in the 30s or low 40s, you can spray as much herbicide as you want. It's not going to kill the cover crop because that cover crop is not actively growing. We really need that cover crop to be actively growing for the herbicide to be taken up and translocated in a way that will effectively kill that cover crop. So ideally, it's maybe in the 50s or above. It's a little better if it's sunny than cloudy. Looking at the forecast for the next couple of days can be helpful, but main thing is that day of spraying. If we're spraying in the morning, making sure it's warm enough for the cover crop to be actively growing. We also have to think about what combination of herbicides we're using. So if we're killing a grass cover crop like rye, you can get by with just glyphosate. I'll show you some more specific options here in a second. But if we're doing legumes, just using glyphosate is normally not enough. It may kind of set back that legume like crimson clover, but it could keep growing. So we need to add something like 2,4-D to the mix to effectively kill that legume. We also need to think about soil moisture conditions. So I'm going to talk to you about terminating early versus late. And then if we're using a mix of cover crops, thinking about, okay, what's going to work to kill all these species at the same time. So looking at some specific herbicide options, these come from Kevin Bradley, our weed scientist at the university, weed extension specialist. He's done quite a bit of research with his staff to look at what works well for some of our more common cover crop options. So although cereal rye, for example, can be killed with just glyphosate, and that's probably the most common way it's killed, if you really want to be sure to get a complete kill on it, a farmer can add some Sharpen or Select to that glyphosate mix to just make absolutely sure it's going to take out that rye. Similarly to wheat, you can add select to the glyphosate. Now, annual ryegrass is an interesting one. It's been popular for a long time in Missouri as an annual forage, but there's been a big red caution flag around it from our weed scientists for using it as a cover crop because there are herbicide-resistant types of ryegrass popping up around the globe. Now, we don't know that it's necessarily happened a lot in Missouri in terms of the herbicide resistance with ryegrass, but I will tell you that ryegrass can be tricky to terminate. It's more important than with any of the other grasses to have the right spring conditions, warm, sunny day to terminate it. And there's actually a whole publication available on terminating or controlling annual ryegrass as a cover crop that goes into lots of detail about how to effectively do it. But what Kevin would say is using glyphosate and select is the key way to take it out. And again, having the right weather conditions. A hairy vetch is a legume. Here we're going to either use glyphosate with a broadleaf product like 2,4-D, or we could go with Liberty or gramoxone. Austrian winter peas, glyphosate with sharpened. So just to give you some examples of some specific strategies. And there are other options that Kevin has outlined for some other cover crops as well. So what about terminating mechanically? Let's say you've got an organic farmer, or for some reason somebody just wants to do it in a method other than with herbicides. So our main two mechanical options would be roller crimper or mowing, although we certainly can do tillage, but that kind of fights against what we're trying to achieve with soil health. So if we're mowing or using a roller crimper, we need to do that normally during a reproductive or flowering period. If we go out when that cover crop is still 6 inches tall and it's a vegetative growth stage like rye or crimson clover, and I've done this, you go out there with a roller crimper or mow it, it's just not going to kill it normally. So you need it to be flowering, and then generally these techniques will work. Now, roller crimper is a really interesting approach. This was developed initially by a couple different groups, including the Rodale Research Center in Pennsylvania. They and others came up with this idea of having these metal bands or flutes along the roller to help break the xylem and phloem tissue in the stem. So that's what we call crimping. You can take just a plain roller out there and it might work. I've seen farmers do that where it breaks the stems, but these crimpers have a much better success rate than just a plain roller. So if it's really muddy and soft conditions, that can be a challenge for getting the roller crimper to work. It works a little better if the ground is firmer, so it can crimp that stem more effectively. Or if you've got just a really thick biomass, let's say you've got 5 foot tall cereal rye with a bunch of hairy vetch and other stuff in there, that can be a bit challenging. Sometimes it might take a couple passes with the roller to completely kill it. Early on, when this approach was being developed, the thinking was put the roller on the front, put the planter on the back. As you're rolling along, you're knocking that cover crop down one direction. The planter works well, and it does physically work well. But if, let's say, we're an organic farmer, that's not quite ideal because that furrow opener will leave a little opening where some weed seed can come up along the furrows. So the current thinking is that generally it's better to plant the cash crop and then roll it. But it just depends on the situation that the farmer is trying to do. And we do see a lot more roller crimper options today. There are some that are quite wide where multiple units are put together. Of course, those cost more money. If you get just a basic one that's like a 10-foot roller crimper, those are not very expensive, although everything's gone up in price. But a couple of years ago, they were running around $5,000 or $6,000. I'm not sure what today's price is. And we see some smaller roller crimpers that have been added directly to planters. That's yet another option to go with. So similarly with a mower, we're waiting for flowering to do that mowing. And once that cover crop is flowering, whether it's rye producing a seed head or a legume producing flowers, we can go in and mow it. It does help to mow as close to the ground as is feasible. And something like a flail mower might do a little better job, especially with distributing the residue, but it really, any type of mower can work. It's more about the timing of doing that mowing operation. And here's just an example of a field day I was at where they had side-by-side rolled a summer cover crop, in this case sorghum Sudan, rolled down with a roller crimper on the left and then mowed on the right. You can see that the roller actually provides a little more uniform residue cover for the soil, and that's one reason some farmers do like the roller crimpers. All right, what about grazing? We've got a lot of cattle and other grazing animals in Missouri. Can we terminate cover crops successfully with grazing? Well, yes, but there's a major but there. It's really important to do it in the right way because you need a really high stocking density and you've got to do it at the right time to make it work. So I wouldn't necessarily advocate this for a first-time cover crop user, but for somebody that wants to experiment with it, certainly encourage them to try it. They need to graze that cover crop quite hard and remove a lot of the biomass to kind of make it like you're mowing through there. That's really what you're trying to simulate. If they're just kind of going out there and kind of trampling some of it and eating some of it, they're going to get some of that cover crop bouncing back. What about tillage? Well, we do see some farmers terminate their cover crops through tillage. I mean, the farm that I grew up on back in the 60s, we had cover crops. That's what we did. We plowed down sweet yellow clover in the spring, something we overseeded into wheat. We still see some farmers doing that, especially organic farmers. Again, it's not ideal from a soil health perspective where we like to minimize disturbance of the soil, but it's a fact that some farmers are going to do this. So if they're tilling, they just want to be sure to get the appropriate tillage depth to truly kill that plant and disturb the growing of the plant. It can be beneficial if we're dealing with slugs or voles to have some light tillage. So it might be a situation where light disking can work to terminate the cover crop as well as to help reduce the population of those pests. And then let's look briefly at timing before we wrap up here. So generally for a first-time cover crop user, I would recommend encouraging them to terminate early. That way they're less likely to have any issues with planting their cash crop. They've got a minimum amount of cover crop residue in that situation, less likely to have any pest issues such as slugs that might be occurring. It can keep the cover crop from drying out the soil too much. It's just a more comfortable approach for a first-time user. We do need to be a little careful about having somebody, let's say, that lets their rye, maybe it's kind of a wet spring, they let their rye get 2 or 3 feet tall, and then they think, well, I think I'm going to be planting in a couple of weeks, I'm going to go out and terminate that. Well, I'm not saying that can't work, but there's definitely been plenty of cases where somebody does that, and then they kind of end up with this wet mass of rye or other cover crop residue where it's keeping their soil from drying out. It's complicating planting situations. So it's really better to terminate pretty early or wait later, kind of depending on the weather conditions. So let's talk about planting late. The new trend you may have heard about is planting green. This is the idea as pictured here, where you're going into a still living cover crop like this rye that's about 4 or 5 feet tall, planting the cash crop and then terminating after planting the cash crop. Typically with a herbicide, but you could use a roller crimper or other method. So I'm going to, in a seminar we have, or webinar in 2 weeks, go into quite a bit of detail on the planting green approach and how to set a planter for successful cash crop planting with cover crop residue. But today I just wanted to mention that if we're taking this later approach, the advantage here not only is that the cover crop is providing more benefits for the soil by getting more organic matter and more erosion control, but we're also really helping with weed control if we can let that cover crop go longer. And with the emergence of more herbicide-resistant weeds, that can be a big plus. The other thing we're seeing, our climatologists are telling us that in the Midwest in general, we're seeing more occurrence of excessively wet springs. Now, as we get into late summer, it's kind of a different picture. We are seeing some areas drier late summers, but the springs are trending towards more prolonged wet conditions. So the cover crop can be a tool to help manage that. It can help draw down some of that excess soil moisture in the spring. So planting into that living cover crop may allow a more timely planting of our cash crop, again, depending on spring conditions. But if the conditions are drying out, then we need to get in there and terminate that cover crop as quickly as possible so that we don't overdry the soil. Okay, so just to summarize a few points on terminations, if we are using herbicides, we need to think about matching that to the species that we're spraying. If a farmer is not wanting to use herbicides for termination, again, obviously there are these mechanical options I've talked about, the roller crimper, mowing, even tillage in some cases. Just have to pay a little more attention to that growth stage of the cover crop. And then for a first-time cover crop user, something that is going to winter kill may be more comfortable as a way for them to get started, especially before corn, for example. If we are using an overwintering cover crop, again, early termination may be helpful for that first-time user. But for farmers, as they get experience, some of this late termination is getting popular, and I'm definitely seeing a lot of experienced cover crop users shift more and more to using late termination as long as it's not a particularly dry spring. So I'll just close by saying we do have 3 more upcoming webinars. One next week that will go into cover crops and wildlife that'll be delivered by Bethany Worley, a cover crop educator on our staff here at the Center for Regenerative Ag. And then in 2 weeks, I'm going to talk with you about strategies for cash crop planting, and then we'll end up with a session on grazing cover crops at the end of the month. And all these are at the same time, 12:15 on Thursdays, same Zoom link as today. So we hope you can join us for those. So I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see the chat box here, and happy to take any questions either in chat or that you want to just unmute and go ahead and ask. So